Hello to everyone, to all my viewers. This is the Real Faith Conversations podcast with Michael Bridwell, and I am joined by my former pastor, Vietnam veteran, and general minister for over 40 years, Phil Carney. Welcome, sir.
Good to be here. Thank you, Michael.
So let's just jump right in, and as for the people that don't know, this show is about telling stories. And telling stories that wouldn't normally occur. So this is what Pastor Phil's going to do for us today. He's going to tell his story, and so we're just going to jump right in and start at the beginning. What was your childhood like?
My childhood. Well, I was born in 1951, so I was a baby boomer, and grew up in a small town in Southern California. But my home life and childhood, I guess I would describe as quite dysfunctional. It wasn't necessarily a happy, healthy home by any means. Father who was a alcoholic, and a mother that was kind of an enabler and in denial. And so to kind of simplify it, I kind of raised myself and grew up with very little structure, or didn't feel I was very well equipped for life from my home life. So that's kind of in a nutshell my childhood.
So you were basically a latchkey kid.
Yes, pretty much.
So did you suffer of physical abuse, mental abuse? Could you kind of go into that a little bit?
Yeah, some of both. Some physical abuse, also verbal, abuse. Nothing affirming. Nothing was ever good enough or well done enough. That kind of thing. So and also just a lot of neglect. Just always kind of felt ignored and neglected, and if there was communication, it was kind of what you're not doing right and you're in the way.
So how'd you break out of that?
Well, that came years and years later, but as I kind of grew up in that and through middle school and high school, when I graduated from high school, I guess my breakout to get away from home and to get away from the life as I knew it. I was just, this was in 1969. I graduated from high school in 1969. And right just before I graduated, just a few weeks before I graduated, I was walking down Main Street in the little town that I grew up in. And there was a military recruiting office right there on Main Street. And the Marine Corps recruiter was standing out on the sidewalk in his dress blues. And when I walked by him, he said, "Hey, young man, let me ask you a question." So I stopped and he said, "How would you like to do something that you'll be proud of for the rest of your life and will completely change how you feel about yourself?" Well, I was 18 years old, about ready to graduate from high school with no direction. And so I was immediately interested in what further he had to say. So I went into his office, and of course, being a recruiter, he promised me all kinds of good things, but I kind of forgot about the Vietnam War in the mix. And so anyway, I enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18. And as soon as I graduated from high school, I was in the Marine Corps. And so that was really the first time I was away from home and, out of the surroundings that I was in. And so that was kind of my breakout. That was the break between my home life and my parents and something different.
Did you ever get any support from your other family members, or were you just isolated and alone? Did siblings, grandparents
Yeah, well, here's how this goes. I had no grandparents. My grandparents were all gone when I was really little. They had already, two of them had already died before I was born, and the other two died when I was very, very little. So I never knew my grandparents. I had four older siblings. My oldest brother was killed when I was real little. Um, and my other siblings were a lot older than me. I was the youngest and kind of a late in life baby. So by the time I was, in elementary school, all of my siblings had left. They took off in other directions, and so I was pretty much an only child, even though I had siblings, and they never came around. They didn't come back home either, for all the same reasons. So no, I didn't get a lot of support, and I didn't have close relationship.
Teachers, did you have any sort of other outlets outside of like hobbies or something that would kind of take your mind off the abuse at home?
Well, I liked sports in middle school and high school, but again, I never had, a dad or anything that would come to, he never came to anything. And so, the affirmation side, I never felt like that really was meeting a need in my life. So even though I like sports and I played some sports, I wasn't, I didn't feel like it was a real big outlet. And then, so by the time I was like going into my senior year and stuff, I was starting to kind of hang with the wrong crowd where I got recognition and doing a lot of the wrong things. So, yeah, I didn't have a lot of outlets.
Drugs, stuff like that.
Oh, for sure.
What do you think? What because you say that your dad was kind of the abuser and your mom was kind of the enabler of the abuse. What do you think caused it on his end to act out that way?
Well, I didn't know at the time or as growing up, you wouldn't know. You're just not mature enough to stop and think about what his childhood was like or where he came from. But it became obvious much later in life when I learned some things about my dad. A lot of things I learned after he died, but he had a very abusive childhood and was raised in alcoholism, and his mother died when he was only 8 years old, and he was the youngest child, and all of his brothers and dad were gamblers and drinkers, and so he experienced a very harsh childhood. He never learned the things that he needed. So I think he was filled with a lot of anger, and he was medicating himself. And so, I found that out and learned that and was able to understand that much later in my life. So, but at the time, I didn't know. That's just all I knew. That's just who he was. But I never thought of why.
So what caused your mom to like? Because you say she basically enabled the toxic
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
What caused her to not stand up for you and her and
I
you
don't
think?
know. I think she just was a very weak person and was in very deep denial about the situation. My mom just, it was the kind of thing, if you said it was okay, it was okay.
Right.
So she was just always making excuses and trying to make it all right, and it's not that bad and that sort of thing. So she was just, in a very dark place herself. And like my dad, my mom, had a very sad childhood, very poor. Um, so um, she just, she had her own struggles. So I mean, you find out later I was just being raised by two people that were very dysfunctional and had really deep unresolved life issues that they had never addressed. And so, you become a victim of that.
Right, right. And like you said, the cycle continued. Well,
Right.
not with your kids, obviously, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
cycle continued because it. But you joined the army to get away from all that, and then you said you kind of hinted that you were shipped off immediately to Vietnam, and talk about that for a minute.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was just kind of typical. I went in the Marine Corps in 1969, and again, very young and uh, naive to things like war and death and all of that. And you have to remember, I grew up in the generation of, the baby boomers, and our parents were World War II veterans and experienced World War II, and America was, saved the world, and they were known as the greatest generation. So you grow up in that environment, and that's what you hear about America and war and all of that, and all the movies and TV programs were very, you know, painted towards, America was always the savior, and war was a romantic kind of thing, and so that was my concept of something like a war and death. But obviously, reality is very, very different than that. And Vietnam, of course, was a very controversial and different kind of war than America had ever experienced before. So I went into the Marine Corps thinking about, well, if I go to war, it's going to be like, I'm going to be like a hero type of thing. It's going to be cool. And so, I went through basic training and all of my different training after boot camp. I was in the infantry. And so 6 months later, 6 months after I enlisted, I arrived in Vietnam for a year tour of duty and was with a combat infantry unit. And all of a sudden, reality was very different than what an 18-year-old kid's image of war and combat and all of that would be. So all of that to say, Vietnam was instantly very traumatic, and it was just a matter of trying to survive and stay alive and hopefully get back home.
Mhm.
So that year in Vietnam and my experiences in Vietnam uh, changed me in very, very deep ways, and certainly not for the better. So that just compounded some of the life issues I was already struggling with from my childhood.
So you talk about Vietnam and you talk about your experiences. Could you, like, without going into too much detail, would you mind going into a little bit more depth of what you kind of went through?
Well, yeah, I think any Vietnam veteran will tell you it was kind of a twofold experience in terms of, on one hand, the bond between you. There was actually a TV series, I think it was about World War II, called Bond of Brothers. And that's certainly true for young men that serve in the military together, especially in a combat experience where people are being killed and you're dying, and you're relying on one another to stay alive. So on one hand, for the first time in my life, I experienced relationships with my comrade at arms, so to speak. I experienced relationship and love relationship with these guys that I had never experienced in my life. And the bond with them was so deep and so it's hard to describe, closer than any brother could ever be. So on that side of the experience, it was remarkable to me that I could feel those kinds of emotions for other people, and them for me. We loved each other and depended on each other. And so I formed deep, deep relationships that I never would have known without that experience. But on the other side of the experience, it's very traumatic, because at 18 years old, seeing other young men your age and maybe a couple of years older uh, dying and being killed in brutal ways was it was just difficult to process. It was unimaginable. Um, I had only been in Vietnam a very, very short time when I saw the first casualty, and I'd never seen a dead person before, or somebody killed, or somebody dying. And so that was very hard, and that deeply changes you. And you're also in an environment that you don't have time or the luxury to grieve those things or to really process those things. You just move on. And it may be somebody that you've come to know and built a bond with, and you lose them, somebody that you love deeply and care about, and you lose them, but you're not allowed to mourn or grieve. You don't have time for that. And so you just move on. And this goes on day after day after day, week after week, month after month. And this is compounded in you. On top of that is all of the other traumatic things that you see and you experience that is very, very difficult to to process. So that just kind of builds up, and it's just a lot of compounded trauma. And at that age, 18, 19, 20 years old, you are not anywhere close. You're still developing, mentally and emotionally. You're not. And so you're in an environment that is doing a lot of damage to you emotionally, even though physically you're fighting to stay alive. So, and then on top of that, Vietnam was not a celebrated or accepted war. And unfortunately, in the Vietnam War, many Vietnam veterans were really treated brutally, and more harm was done when they came home because they were not accepted, not celebrated, not thanked, in many cases, not even acknowledged, because the nation was so divided concerning the war in Vietnam. So that made, that was just another element of the Vietnam experience as a veteran and somebody that served there, that it made it further harder to recover and recuperate from what you had experienced when you came home.
Right. As a veteran, could you describe to the people that, like myself, and people that came after that weren't that know about Vietnam, that know about the history, say 90s and later,
Mm-hmm.
that weren't affected necessarily, because my grandfather wasn't a Vietnam veteran; he was a Cold War veteran,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't have that history. So, could you describe the average soldier's? I guess I kind of already asked this question, but could you describe what it really was like outside of like the histories, and how was there much difference, or was there much difference between what the political class was saying, or and from what you were experiencing, or was
You
it pretty
mean
much
during the war?
during the war? Yes.
Um, well, I think how I would answer that is, yeah, it was a very politicized war on a lot of levels. So yeah, there was so many different viewpoints and opinions concerning the Vietnam War. It was the first war that was ever televised. The first time any American ever saw an American soldier killed in combat on television was the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War was televised. It was on the news every night. People became very tired of seeing that and very disillusioned in seeing that. And then it was just, again, it was very political. There was not clear objectives. And so there were different opinions. There were different opinions among, especially later in the war, among the soldiers that were fighting in Vietnam. Some still believed, in what they were doing. Others believed, they were being sent to a slaughter for no reason. So it was just, it was really, really a mess. And so I think in the early days of the Vietnam War, there was a clear objective, and I think it could have been won, but politics got involved, and we changed presidents 3 times. during the Vietnam War and political parties. And so, yeah, it just wasn't clear. The and personally, as a Vietnam veteran, I had no issue with somebody that didn't agree with the war. I had no issue with somebody that burned their draft card and refused to go, somebody that left and went to Canada because they didn't believe in the war, somebody that went to jail because they refused to go into the military to be drafted. I didn't think there was anything wrong with those positions and those decisions. As Americans, we have a right to make those decisions. So as a young Marine that went to Vietnam, that enlisted and went to Vietnam, I didn't have an issue with those people. My issue was, if you disagreed with the war, I didn't have a problem with you protesting, with you marching, with burning your draft card. But the target of protest should have never been the young men that went. We shouldn't have been the target of your protest and your outrage and your insults. That should have been, your target should have been the political parties that were sending and drafting young men to Vietnam. But the veterans that went and came home should not have been punished for going just because you didn't agree with it. So that's how I don't think that was ever made clear.
Uh,
I think
um,
I think history missed that spot.
um, so, how were your interactions with the people, like with the locals of Vietnam?
It was very mixed.
Very.
Yeah, you had to be very, very careful who you trusted, again, because it wasn't clear who the enemy was all the time. And so you had to be very careful. So it was pretty dangerous to become close or friendly or trusting of the people. And that was just another part of the Vietnam War, unfortunately, that was tragic. A lot of innocent people, but that's true in every war. It's true in the war that's going on right now. Civilians and innocent people get in the way or become victims of the war. But that was certainly true in Vietnam. So the interaction with the people for combat veterans was, you had to be very, very careful. And it was not really a healthy practice to get close to civilians.
So, you describe, like you said in the pre-interview, your main mission was search and destroy,
Mhm.
which we all know about that, and we don't need to go into details of that. That's not necessary for this. But you describe, without saying it, you seem to suffer from a lot of PTSD from your combat
Mhm.
experience. Could you describe, like, your struggles with that during the war, but also after?
Yeah, well, during the war, like I said, you didn't really have time, to you're kind of in the middle of the cause, and you're just trying to get home. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, wasn't even a diagnosis. Nobody even knew what that term was. It wasn't ever heard or used until the mid 80s. So guys coming home from Vietnam that we now know were suffering deeply and drastically of PTSD. Well, there was no PTSD. There was no name for it. It was called other things, battle fatigue or those sort of things. And so there was no treatment. There was no help for it. You were just kind of told to get on with your life and get over it. And that's in the past and that sort of thing. It wasn't understood. So the the huge reality for me was, and I think for a lot of other guys, was the whole time you're in Vietnam, you're fighting to stay alive, to get home. And that you talked about it a lot of times. You talk about, man, when I get home, I'm going to do this. When I get home, I'm going to do that. And when I get home, this is the first thing I'm going to do. And so what you created in your mind, this thing that you created in your mind was, if I can get out of here, if I can get through Vietnam, if I can get home, everything will be fine. because I'm home. This will be in my past. It'll be over. It won't bother me. I'll be home now. I'm safe. I'm home. Only to find out when you get home, in your mind and in your emotions and in your trauma and in your nightmares and in your dreams and in everything around you, you're still in Vietnam. You can't leave it. It come home with you. The terror, the fear, all of the weird behaviors that it created comes home with you. So you get home, and with the hope that, oh, I'm home, I made it home, everything's okay now. But you have PTSD, which nobody knew what that was. So you can't sleep. You have nightmares. You have all these weird behavioral dysfunctions that you don't even understand why you have them. You feel like so many things threaten you, um, on and on and on. Loud noises, you're hyper vigilant, you're on edge all the time. You're not the same person. Everything's not all right. So that is another huge letdown. If I could just get home, I'm going to be okay. I'm home. There's something wrong with me.
It's like that song "Still Inside God" by a country singer. I can't remember the name escapes me, but I've listened to that song.
Yeah.
But um, and and he described a lot of what you were describing. That
Yeah.
it's just a war of the mind, basically.
It is.
And
Yeah.
and but so how'd you cope with that after you got you came back,
Mm-hmm.
and so how was your military career going forward?
Well, I came back from Vietnam. I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, Southern California, at Camp Pendleton for the remainder of the time I was in. I, I served. My title, we were troop handlers. We actually worked in one of the infantry schools. It was called Infantry Training Regiment as a troop handler. You just went out and played war games and taught guys how to do combat tactics and how to fire all the different weapons. So I was an instructor. Then I got out of the Marine Corps. So I did that for the rest of the time. And that's where I really started to drink heavily, but everybody was drinking heavily, all for the same reasons. So every night after we got off duty, it was drinking. Every weekend it was drinking, um, smoking marijuana, doing drugs. So by the time I got out of the Marine Corps, I was well on my way to being addicted to alcohol and drugs. Then I got out of the Marine Corps, stayed in Southern California, and for the next 6 to 8 years, I was just all over the board. I was a wreck. I was a mess, medicating myself from this job to that job. I had a real hard time functioning. I had all kinds of issues, typical story. I mean, this story is so typical of literally hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans. Um, so I just was drifting about and trying to find my way. I just did lots of different jobs, couldn't find a fit, was becoming the thing I hated, the violent alcoholic like my dad. And plus, I had all these PTSD issues, and but didn't know what it was. You just didn't talk about it, but just medicated it. And finally, I decided I wanted a nice, clean indoor job. I'd been working a lot of different physical jobs and so on. So I found this school for respiratory therapy, which was kind of a new field in the early 70s. So I went down, took the test. It was GI Bill, paid for it. So I went to school for a year, became a respiratory therapist. And then I moved to Las Vegas, Nevada, because there was a big hospital there that was advertising that they desperately needed respiratory therapists. So I moved to Las Vegas, which wasn't a great environment for my condition, but nonetheless, that's where I ended up, in Las Vegas in the mid 70s. working as a respiratory therapist, but still, just a wreck. And but it was very common. We found out later, guys with PTSD and guys that had survived the Vietnam War, many of them, whether consciously, probably unconsciously, would seek out jobs that took care of other people, police officers, firemen, medical personnel, that sort of thing. Uh, I, I found out later the reason for that was because of a thing called survivor's guilt. Guys that survived the Vietnam War, many of us really had this thing called survivor's guilt. So you felt like you had to kind of pay for being alive. You owed everybody something because you got to come home and all those other guys didn't. So that was rewarding. And the fact that if you're immersing yourself in helping and saving other people, then you don't have to deal with your stuff. It's kind of a diversion thing. So that was attractive to me. I really liked doing respiratory therapy, working in a hospital, saving other people.
Right.
So
Right.
that's what I was doing. But I was still a wreck.
I mean, many people are. Many people are. So how'd you get from, you know, Vietnam vet, combat vet, to and drug addict to believer?
Yeah. Well, I it's funny you would term it that way because for different reasons, I was always a believer. I always believed in God. Never had an issue like there's no God. I never believed that. I always believed there was a God. I believed that I believed in Jesus. I believed there was a person named Jesus who lived on the earth 2,000 years ago, who said he was the Son of God, died on a cross for everybody's sins. I believed all of that. I always believed that. And in Vietnam, many times, I would pray, God help me, Jesus help me live through this, so I believed in that there was a God and that I believed in Jesus. I believed in all of those things. I believed the Bible was the word of God, although I had never read it or didn't own one. But I never did anything about it. And I didn't really know what you were supposed to do about it. And I didn't really know how to do anything about it. I had never really heard the salvation message of Jesus that you can accept and receive what Jesus has done and who he is, and this whole born again experience and redemption and salvation and a renewed spirit and all of those biblical terms for what Jesus offers all of humanity. I didn't know about that. And so there was just a guy that I worked with that was a real solid Christian guy. And he kind of shared his story with me. And I said, "Oh, so you like received Jesus kind of a thing." He's going, "Yeah, you got to receive it, Doesn't matter that you believe that it's there until you receive it." It's like and I never forget the analogy, and I've used it 1,000 times as a pastor in public, altar calls and invitations to receive Christ. He said, it's like if I had a Bible and I said, "I bought this Bible for you. You didn't pay for it. I bought it, and it's my gift to you, and I want you to have it, and I want to give it to you." No matter how much you believe that, no matter how much you acknowledge that, until you reach out and take the Bible and receive it, it doesn't belong to you. And he said, "Phil, that's exactly where you're at with Jesus. You believe in Jesus, you believe he's who he says he is, but he's not your savior and he's not part of your life until you receive him and you receive everything he's done." And I went, "Oh, well." And so then I really began to consider, well, maybe that would make a difference. Maybe that's what I'm looking for. Maybe that would help. And so I did that all by myself in my apartment in Las Vegas, Nevada. I made that decision sitting at the dining room table, drinking alcohol at the dining room table, crying because my life was such a wreck. And I just said, Lord, I'm just saying to you, I'm asking, I'm receiving you and who you are and what you've done for me, just like Bob was his name said. And something happened in my life. I I changed. I knew something had happened. I didn't hear, tambourines or angels singing or anything. I just instantly knew, wait a minute, something just happened in me. And it did. Things began to change in my life. And I found an incredible church there in Las Vegas, an incredible church. And I went to church for the first time, and it was like home. Everything they did and said, even though I had never been in a setting like that, seemed to be exactly perfect. Like it wasn't foreign or weird to me. You know how you hear people, they come into church that have never been in church and they go, oh, that's going to freak them out. They're not going to understand this. I didn't understand anything they were doing, but I believed everything they were doing. I thought, this is what you're supposed to do. This is awesome. I didn't understand everything the preacher preached, but I believed every word he said. And it was just like, this is it. This is where I belong. This is where I'm supposed to be. This is what I need. And then he explained the gospel and gave a public invitation for people that wanted to receive Christ. And I went forward again. I had already made that commitment. So I thought, well, I want to make this public. And I went forward again and prayed. He led everybody in prayer, kind of like a Billy Graham crusade thing. Then, it was just, I found a home and everything changed. I found new friends, new relationships. I became very close with the pastor. I was baptized, just my life began to rapidly change.
So describe your journey from new believer to pastor. How was that transition?
Wow. Well, and I kind of left out a piece in the mix of all of that. I met my wife, Maria.
Right.
She worked at the same hospital where I worked. She worked in medical records. She was not a believer either. And we were married, just had been married a few weeks when I made that decision for Christ. And then she, shortly after that, came to know the Lord as well. So Maria and I were newly married and new Christians. And so both of our lives had changed drastically, and we were on this big, new, exciting adventure as Christians. But I had no idea what the Lord had in mind in terms of ministry. But the Lord had that in mind for us. That was His will for us. And the church that we were in Las Vegas, where we both had come to Christ, was a very large church and a very progressive church. And the pastor was planting small churches all over southern Nevada in little outlying communities where some of them didn't even have a church. And so, to make a long story very, very short, it was in that environment that the Lord called us to ministry. And we ended up going out to plant and to start one of these new churches in a little community outside of Las Vegas, under the supervision, of course, of our home church and pastor, and several other young couples within that church God called and raised up to do the same thing. So within 2 years from the time we were saved, from the time we came to Christ, within 2 years later, we were actually starting and pastoring our first church outside of Las Vegas. So we were on God's fast track. I don't recommend it, but that's just how God did it for us. It was an accelerated program.
Yeah, it's funny because I want to do the same thing that you're doing, and I'm 31 and not even close. So
Yeah.
so But it's funny, how some people it's a slow burn, and some people, God's plan is just fast tracked.
Yes,
So
that's right.
so um, but what was your biggest struggle as a pastor? Um, was it the PTSD?
In hindsight, probably so. Yeah, probably so. I still had that was still unattended to, and what I've learned about someone that has PTSD, and you can be born again, filled with the Spirit, love the Lord, living right, and even in ministry and pastoring a church, and have issues on board. Um, and there's this. I guess what I'm saying is, don't be naive and make the mistake of thinking that once you come to Christ, give your life to Christ, once you're born again, once you're saved, boom, everything in your life is fine, and you don't have things to work through and be delivered from and healed from and grow from and all of that. And certainly PTSD was a real issue for me. But remember, again, nobody knew what PTSD was. I wasn't going around saying, I think I have PTSD and I'm not telling anybody about it. After that many years, you just kind of learn to live with it. And again, now I'm pastoring a church and I'm taking care of people and their needs and their problems, which is a great diversion. It's not that I was being phony, but in a sense, I was allowing ministry to be a form of how I medicated my own issues. And I think that's more common than uncommon for pastors and people in ministry. Um, I think it's hard for people to admit that. I probably wouldn't have admitted it if somebody would have called that out, but I'm just saying it happens. Sometimes you can have unattended issues, things in your life, behavioral issues or emotional or traumatic issues. It could be a lot of things. And ministry can serve as a diversion to that. And again, it's not that you're not called of God or you're not sincere. It's just that you're using ministry in a way that you shouldn't have to use ministry. You should be providing ministry, not using it to make yourself feel better or to ease something that is difficult in your own life. And I'm sure I was doing that to some degree. Um, like I said, as long as I can immerse myself and give myself to helping other people and solving their problems and walking them through their traumas and losses and difficulties, then I don't have to look at mine.
It's funny you talk about that because when we were going through the courses at Pendleton First for Pendleton First Studies, it was particularly talking about the mission field, but
Mm-hmm.
it's very apt here. And they said one of the main reasons for you not to become a missionary is to hide from your other
Yeah,
problem from your issues.
right.
That is not a reason because
Yeah,
because those problems are going to be right there when you come back. So
yeah,
I
yeah.
just I found it's interesting that you highlight that was a particular struggle of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was let's kind of shift gears here. What was you say you just yeah, like baby Christians, you
Mm-hmm.
guys kind of just within 2 years you planted a church. Um how was that first experience
Oh, it's
as
wonderful.
leaders?
Yeah, it was like, we were young and naive and had no idea what we didn't know and couldn't do. And you just believe in God for everything. It was a really exciting time. We started a church in a small community. It was a real rough community, but we just saw amazing things happen. We started in a living room of a house and then moved into a community building that we rented. And then we finally got some property and then we built a building and the church grew, and starting all of the different and new ministries. So it was an exciting decade. We were there for 10 years, and it was exciting. I mean, lots of struggles, lots of mistakes. Um, but it was it was a time that really shaped our lives, for further ministry, for what was still in front of us. But um, it was great. It was wonderful. We have great memories of that first church and that church plant. And that church is still there. We went back for the 40-year anniversary like 3 years ago. We were asked to come back, and the church is thriving. They have 2 services on Sunday morning. It's grown. The facilities have grown. And so that felt good too, to know that it went on and continued to be a real make a deep impact in that community still today.
So what was your biggest lessons as a young pastor? As a young pastor, what would you take away from that first church experience?
My biggest lesson?
Yeah.
Well, I learned that you don't do good ministry alone. Every pastor needs resources and mentors and people that you draw from. You never outgrow that. I mean, I did that up until the day I retired. I had people that I asked questions. You never know what you don't know, and you don't have enough perspective to pastor a church without that. So I think that's critical. As I learned that early on, because and I think I desired that early on because I was so ill-equipped. I entered ministry so soon and so quick that I knew I didn't know. I felt I was way in over my head. So I made sure I had resources. I was a sponge, but that just stuck. So that is a lesson that I learned that I hope served me well all through ministry, is that you have to have lots of voices around you that are saying things and that are giving you different perspectives and different thoughts, so that you make very informed decisions. I also think that I learned that perfection is not a requirement for ministry. Sometimes you feel like, man, you can't have any issues, can't have any problems. You got it. Yeah, it's not true. Uh, I mean, you'd have to look no further than who Jesus called and used to in the first century to lead and start the church. All of those leaders had histories and problems. So I learned that God will use you. It's a matter of your heart and the level of humility that you have, which is critical. I think those are just some of the key things that maybe I learned that um, served throughout the rest of ministry.
Okay. So I know for a fact that you've had like 4 different churches under your belt. And
Right.
so how would you describe, because you said it was in the pre-interview, it was quite different. How would you describe, because your ministry in the desert, like, and then you moved to you moved to Oregon, you moved to the coast of Oregon. How would you describe the cultures between that church in the desert in Nevada
Mhm.
and on the coast of Oregon?
Yeah. Well,
How how different was it?
that was night and day, extremely different, nothing even similar. And that's a great question, Michael, and really a good question. If you're talking about ministry, and especially pastoral ministry, every church is unique to itself and has its own culture. And so, for instance, the church that we came from in Nevada was a church plant. I was the only pastor that had ever been there. Everything was new. The building was new, the property was new, the ministry were new, the people were new, everybody, so it was very new. And then I went to a church on the south coast of Oregon, in Coquille, Oregon, right by Coos Bay, Oregon. Went from the desert to the rainforest, you know. Um, and that church in Oregon was an old church. It had been there since the 1920s. You could look out on Sunday morning and see 4 generations sitting there, grandchildren, parents, grandparents, great grandparents, all that had grown up in that church. So it was a completely different kind of culture in every way. And so as a pastor, you have to understand that when you go from one church to another church, that you have to rely, first of all, on the Lord to give you the anointing, the understanding for that new culture. And that takes time. So when you go from one church to another church, as a rule of thumb, you don't want to do very much. You don't want to change very much. You just want to earn the people's trust. You want to learn the culture. Oh, this is how they do things here. This is what they're about. That just takes time. If you rush in and expect the whole church to adjust to who you are, you will shatter that church instead of you adjusting to who the church is. Um, so culture is huge. That is a big deal. And so going from Southern Nevada, which is very different in every way. The climate's different, of course. The people are different. The church was very different. To Oregon, that was a huge culture shift, and you really have to, like I said, you have to go slow. And that goes back to what I said earlier. I had mentors and men around me that just talked to me at length about that. Phil, when you get there, you'll be tempted. This is what I did in Nevada. This is how I did things in Nevada. This is how we accomplished. This is what worked in Nevada. That's not going to be the case where you're going. Everything's going to be different. The only thing that's going to be the same is the Word of God. That's going to be the same. But everything else, how the people respond, how they worship, how things are done, the kind of ministries is going to be completely different. So you have to be very, very careful and walk slowly. Don't bust in there saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, because it'll feel to them like a step parent has arrived and or somebody's come into your house and started moving all the furniture around. They're going to be offended at you. And so um, that was one of the overall things and that was true in every church that I've pastored, that I went to. It was very, very different, each one. And so you have to be sensitive to that and move slowly and with wisdom and with respect and sensitivity to people. And it takes time to build that bond with the people and earn their trust. Then you can begin to implement vision and change things and move in directions as the Lord leads.
So, a ministry question, because you talk about being sensitive to the culture. Um, when should you implement change, and how should that process start as a new pastor?
Yeah, well, you'll know by the receptivity, and that's the other thing. You have to over communicate everything before you do it, before you implement it. For instance, if you're thinking of changing whatever the service, if you're thinking of changing or adding something or doing something different, you need to over communicate that. You need to talk about that in your board meetings. You need to talk about that in the staff meetings. You need to talk about it publicly in the worship services. Hey, the board and I have been talking about this. We're considering this. We're praying about this. Would you pray with us? And we'd love to hear your feedback. We want to hear what you. So you have to over communicate it before you act on it. And then you'll begin to hear back, positive feedback. You'll be able to get information back, or you're not, or you won't hear anything. And that's usually a good sign when you're over communicating it and asking people, what do you think of this? And you don't hear anything. You can usually take that as a sign of, well, they're good with it. So you need to over communicate it. You need to talk about it a lot and discern and get a sense of, okay, I think we're okay to move forward with this without it fragmenting or shattering something. So in the earlier, now as time goes on and you gain trust and relationship and you've earned credibility with the people and with the leadership in the church, then that's not as necessary. But clear communication is is always a positive thing. You'll get a lot of mileage out of that. If you just rush in and start doing things, and when people are saying, I didn't know about that, or I didn't hear about that, or why are we doing this, you know you haven't communicated it as much as you should. If people are asking why, you should have already explained what you're doing, why you're doing it. Pray with us about that. We want to hear your feedback. Then you've kind of diffused and disarmed people feeling like, well, you're just rushing in, tearing things up, and you're not even asking us how we feel about it. That's always a critical mistake.
Okay, so as a pastor, how much of it is counseling? How much of it is being sensitive? But how much of it is actually telling the truth when you have to, whether biblically or otherwise?
You're talking about with people?
With people, yes. Just the general ministering, whether they're meeting in your office or on the street, or how should a young person like me that's wanting to move into ministry,
Mhm.
what's this formula if there is one?
Well, there isn't one. If there is, I don't know what it is. There's not a formula to it, but
I mean, I
um,
know that, but you know, what's a good tip or trick that I could, people like me could remember?
are you talking about when you're talking to people, dealing with people,
Dealing
with
with people
like
like
their
whether
problems, their issues in a counseling setting, kind of a thing?
kind of, yeah. I guess that's what I'm really asking. Like
Okay.
one-to-one conversations. It doesn't necessarily have to be counseling, but if they were to come with you with a question,
Mhm.
how much would it? How sensitive should you be depending on the question? But when should you lay down the truth if let's say it's going on like a long time, like a persistent problem. So uh uh basically, what's the how sensitive should you be, but also when should you know when to tell the truth, basically?
Okay. So you're kind of talking about talking with somebody about maybe a behavior in their life that is
Yeah,
sinful or destructive, or maybe something they don't even see that they're doing that's causing that sort of thing,
yeah,
or
yeah,
somebody that's doing something within the church that you as a pastor see as, man, this
uh,
can't continue, this is causing problems, that kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Okay, yeah, okay.
yeah,
And so how direct should you be with that person, and so on? And
yeah,
of course,
yeah.
that's a good question, Michael, and that's a real ministry pastor type question for sure, because um, and it's hard to kind of nail that down to, like you said, like a formula, or this is how you always do it, because each scenario is going to have kind of its own uniqueness and so on and so on. But um, using using wisdom and sensitivity and the Word of God and the Spirit of Christ, is always the formula. That's the mixture. You always approach and talk to people with a sense of humility, because on any given day, you could, the tables could be turned. You could be the one that's needing the correction, or hearing what somebody else has to say. So there has to be that sense of humility, and it certainly needs to come in a Christ-like spirit, a spirit of, I'm not doing this to straighten you up or fix you or destroy you. That's not my job, but to help you see what I think I'm seeing, and to understand that this needs to change. And so it's not destructive, it's redemptive is the purpose. And so, with that kind of settled, I think obviously you can approach people in a lot of different ways, depending on who they are, what your relationship is like with them. If you have a really good relation, a deep relation, they know that you love them, that sort of thing. Well, then you approach it a little easier. It's a little more direct. If it's somebody that maybe you don't have that kind of relationship with, you have to be a little more sensitive how you say what needs to be said. But you simply it's hypocritical and pointless to even attempt to talk to somebody about something that needs to be said if you don't intend to say it. But so say it or don't say anything. This is the issue. You need to hear this, but it can also be said, like I was saying, in a spirit of respect, and you can kind of set that up. And sometimes it helps to kind of put people in in a reverse role. A lot of times I would say to people, if you would say, you can't do this in church. Let's just say, I'll just make something up, although I've certainly had this happen. Somebody using inappropriate language in the lobby of the church before or after a service. They're using cuss words, dirty words, talking to somebody or whatever, and kids are hearing that, other people are hearing that. How do you handle that? And that's somebody that goes to the church, is an attender. Well, you can say, this has been brought to my attention, or I've personally heard this. And do you think that's appropriate? Ask them to answer the question instead of saying, this is not appropriate. Do you think this should continue in a public worship service? Do you think this is really love? I mean, do you think that's what children that are walking by should hear in a church service or let me push this. My
Uh,
battery's going low, so I'm going to have to plug in here. So I'm going to give you
okay.
a quick earthquake.
Oh boy.
How's that?
Technical difficulties, everyone. Just it
Okay. Is
happens.
that okay now?
Yeah, it's fine. Fine.
Or, or another way you can say it is, if you were me, if you were the pastor of the church and this was brought to your attention, would you say something?
Yeah.
That's all I'm doing. I love you. I'm not trying to destroy you, or that, I care about you, but also care about the church. And so you can approach things with wisdom, and how you say something is huge. So yeah, you have to confront things have to be challenged. There's even times where it can be so harsh and so difficult that people have to be asked to no longer attend. There's been a few times, very few times, that I've had to do that. That is say, your conduct and your refusal to acknowledge or to adjust your conduct, your behavior in, in public worship just requires that I ask you to please no longer attend until you're willing, to change this or address this. Um, there's biblical precedents for that, and sometimes you have to do that, and that's hard. I mean, that should bring, as a pastor, that should bring you tears. It should break your heart. But so yeah, there's things you have to challenge and deal with, but you can do it in a Christ-like spirit. And so I hope that answers that.
Yeah. So you worked in how long did you work in Coos Bay?
We were the pastors of the church in Coos Bay for 13 almost 13 years, not quite, just lacking a couple of months of being 13 years.
Oh, you
So,
cut out there.
am I back?
You're back.
Okay, good to know.
I'm gonna have to do some editing, obviously, to fix all this. So, but it'll be fine.
Okay,
You just cut out there for some reason. I've never had that happen. So, that's a new one.
so the question was, how long was I in Coos Bay? We were there almost 13 years.
Okay, yeah, 13 years. Got it. And so how did you make the transition? So you made the transition to Pendleton after
Right.
after Coos Bay in 2003. Correct?
2002, actually. Yeah,
2002.
2002.
2002. So I hate to repeat myself, but how different was Coos Bay to Pendleton? Because
Yeah.
you're talking about a town on the coast, and
Yeah.
moving to a western, to moving to Eastern Oregon, that's very much in that Western culture and cowboy culture, and so how did you adjust to that?
Yeah. Well, same answer. I just took it slow. When we arrived in Pendleton, they were just barely starting a significant building program, and it had just barely been started. They had just broken ground and started to pour foundations. So, I mean, I had to attend to that, and of course had really good board members and so on that were helping lead that. So it wasn't like all in my lap, but it's still, that was a lot of my time, was taken in this building program. So that, I had to be on top of that. But as far as the ministry side of it and the people side of it, again, yeah, I just took it really, really slow. I didn't add a lot of new things. I didn't change much at all. I just took time to get to know the culture and the people and the history of the church, where the church had been, where we could go, that sort of thing. And you can accomplish that by just having conversations. I mean, my board meetings in the early days of Pendleton were just more about me asking questions. I just used the board as a resource. I asked lots of questions about the community, about, what's Pendleton like? Give me history on Pendleton First, the church, so on and so on and so on. So I just took it slow the first year I was there, and just tried to gain the trust of people. And I just didn't do a lot of restructuring ministry. I just tried to build on what was there, just tried to move forward and build on what was already there. And just trying to learn the culture. And again, we just communicated a lot with the church. This is what's happening. This is what we would like to do. I had lots of meetings with the membership and with the church, just talking about our future. What do you think? Um, so on and so on. So that's how I made that adjustment. And then after a year and a half, 2 years, we really started getting traction and growth started happening. We finished the new building. That generated a lot of excitement, and um, things started really going forward from there.
Okay, so you were there for nearly 20 years.
I was there just a little over 20 years, 20 years and 2 months. Yeah.
So that's a huge chunk of time.
Yeah.
So what did you learn in that time that you've taken that what was the most impactful thing you've learned?
Well, the most impactful thing that was unique, that was different than anything I had experienced in other churches, um, was that we started to experience a real massive influx of unchurched people and people from very diverse church backgrounds. In other words, people from other that had grown up Catholic, that had grown up Methodist, that had grown up Baptist, and then lots of people that had no church history or background just started coming and showing up at our church. And it wasn't a strategy. It wasn't anything that was planned. It was just something that God started doing. So within about a 3-year period, our church doubled in size, but it was no longer an Assembly of God church in the sense of people that had grown up in the Assemblies of God or were from, these were diverse people from all kinds of different backgrounds. And so that changed the dynamic of our church. It was a wonderful change, but it also demanded of me to change my ministry approach, because on any given Sunday morning, I knew I wasn't talking to Pentecostal, charismatic, Assembly of God churches. I was talking to people that were drawn there because of something that they hungered for, the presence of God, a reality in God that maybe they hadn't experienced before. And so I had to shift how I was doing ministry in terms of I had to explain things that in former churches you assumed everybody knew, like spiritual gifts and miracles and baptism of the Spirit and forms of worship, why we clap our hands, why we dance, why we raise our hands, all of those things. And it was a wonderful experience, but it was a very diverse church. I used to look out and just jokingly, I would say, this looks like the dog pound. There's no there's no purebreds here. It's just a room full of mutts, all different breeds, all different sizes and shapes, all different backgrounds, different beliefs, different histories. So that I learned in that God can do things in your church that he didn't ask you about or warn you about. He can change the dynamic of your church, and you're going to have to adjust to what God is doing instead of you casting some vision and asking God to adjust to your vision. God had his own vision. And so that happened at Pendleton First, and it was a wonderful experience.
You cut out again.
Well, I don't know why that's happening. Maybe the Lord's telling us something.
God damn. Cut out again. You cut out again. Do this again. Hey, you cut out again. Yeah, I don't know what's happening either. I thought it would just come back like it did the last time, but I'm sorry. Yeah, you know, I can probably make it work. I don't, like I said, I've never had that happen, so I don't know what's going on. It's, I'll have to do some research on that. Thank you. Yeah. I hate, yeah. All right, bye.